So I had a few different things come out this year, and actually this is the one that's the most different because it's, yeah, sort of not involved with this whole kind of problem of sort of analysis of contemporary rights issues, which has been a big part of what I've been involved with. But so this was a publication that came out in relation to a journal issue on sort of intellectual histories of internationalism that I worked on together with some colleagues from Gothenburg. And yeah, it reflects a little bit sort of what my background is, a bit more than some other things I do, which is in history and history of ideas specifically. So yeah, the issue I sort of took on there was sort of, I started with this kind of tongue-in-cheek question of whether or not communists like human rights. And yeah, so the point of departure for the special issue, as it is for a lot of people working on internationalism, is obviously sort of the rise or revenge of its other, right? I mean, we are all very aware of the sort of surges of nationalism in recent years, and yeah, sort of more my specific point of departure was sort of this kind of mainstream political discourse that's often had in kind of centrist media, I guess, if one wants to put it that way, which is, you know, sort of, oh my God, with, you know, sort of the phalanx of nationalists that we're being faced with, you know, internationalism is at stake here somehow. But that's often, again, in very mainstream discourse. I'm not talking about so much activist discourses, but sort of more mainstream media discourses. This is often the equation of internationalism with liberalism, and specifically a kind of international democratic institutionalism. So the concern is, if nationalists win, what happens to our free market, our free movements, and our democratic institutions? So, you know, I can also get caught up in that sort of concern, as I think many of us can, you know, challenges to the EU, you know, challenges to, you know, different forms of international cooperation. But yeah, there are a couple of things that struck me about that, which is that, you know, that discourse still reflects in some ways what I call sort of living in the Fukuyama universe. Sort of this kind of post-'89 world where, as Eric Hobsbawm, the historian, once said, we said goodbye to all that, meaning, you know, sort of the red experiments of the 20th century, and sort of moved off into the world of liberal consensus. And obviously we don't have that consensus anymore, but a lot of the reaction against sort of the sort of nationalist rise or wave has been from people sort of like, I don't want to let go of the 90s, like, please, you know, let these let this sort of dream continue to be true somehow. And I think in mainstream discourse, that's often been sort of the battle line, sort of globalists versus nationalists, or internationalists versus nationalists. And I, you know, I think that that's an interesting thing, because I think we're still living with this kind of oblivion that we went into in the 1990s, that there was a whole other world that existed for a good chunk of the 20th century, and that extended out of the dreams of the 19th century in many ways. And at a certain point actually was the primary way that internationalism was often discussed, which was through socialism, in fact. I think in this sort of kind of mainstream kind of media talking heads discourse, that's been totally forgotten sometimes. And so I just thought it would be interesting to sort of kind of put a rope around my waist and jump into that canyon a little bit, and sort of shine the light around again in there for a bit, and sort of see what different kind of, you know, sort of red internationalisms meant. But there is also a sort of kind of remaining issue, which is that we still have parties which sort of nominally call themselves socialist and call themselves social democratic, right? And so what about those? Because they did survive, I mean, in different ways. I mean, they might have gone the third way, they might have gone other routes, they might have gone more populist directions, but are some of these kind of big phalanx sort of social democratic parties, are they what they once were, right? Social democracy has changed a lot over the years. Um, there is a way to look at the history of the split, right? Because of course that's, post Second International, um, around the time of the First World War, that's obviously a big sort of defining moment. And historians have a lot of disagreements about what the nature of that split was. I mean, it had to do with some very concrete issues, but was sort of the social democratic direction, uh, was it no longer in the part sort of in the family of Marxist thought or not? Is what had kind of Bernstein established, was it a totally alternate kind of direction in terms of what socialism might mean? I've also been a bit curious about that as part of this, or was curious, or I mean, you can read the paper. I am curious about sort of what social democracy's role in all this, as we sort of look backwards and think about these different legacies. Yeah, I'm not going to bother with the last point there. Yeah, the argument here was a few different things. I mean, one, if you're going to define forms of, I'm already at the conclusion. If you're going to define forms of internationalism, obviously, you have to define internationalism. Yeah, so I tried to identify kind of two major ways to define this. And one is sort of what I call the sort of more analytical approach, where internationalism is just sort of simply international relations. It's the relations between states, and how those relations are made. But I don't think that that's actually the imagination that most of us have of internationalism. Actually, I think many of us imagine it as a kind of form of kind of international bonhomie, sort of between peoples somehow. And that's sort of the slightly more kind of human rights imagination of it, that internationalism has to do with a sort of attitude of cooperation on a kind of international basis. And so let's just try to move this out of the way so I can move on slides a little bit here. Yeah, part of what I'm seeing, that's nice. There we go. You're all at the bottom now. Great. Part of what I'm suggesting is that, yeah, the end of the Second International and sort of the split between, again, depending on how you want to characterize it, socialism and communism, or social democracy and communism. How exactly do you categorize these things, right? That's obviously a really sort of big issue, but it brought, if we use sort of the paradigm of communism and social democracy, and that's what I use in the paper, that it provides sort of two different models of internationalism as they kind of played out across the 20th century. One, sort of this classic social democratic kind of attempt to put a compromise with the system rather than overthrow it. And that was the attempt to work within liberal institutions to bring about better international cooperation. Themes were often disarmament, international development, women's rights, the environment. These are the great names of Bruno Kreisky and Olof Palme and Willy Brandt. That was one direction that sort of internationalism, kind of a red internationalism, took in the course of the 20th century. Whereas there was a whole other universe of internationalism that played out, and that was in the context of the communist world. And of course, that was a much less compromising attitude. That was sort of a mode of saying, okay, the question isn't developing international brotherhood. The question is instituting it sort of immediately and making sure that boundaries are set up in order to protect international brotherhood. Yeah, this sort of led to some interesting kind of things, right? I mean, on one hand, you had this sort of more compromising sort of let's work within the UN kind of approach, again, represented by people like Kreisky, Palme, and Brandt. In some ways, right, you have the kind of the classic democratic problem. Is it kind of a sellout, this position, or is it actually really trying to move towards sort of a world of de facto equality, on both political and economic fronts? What precisely are its goals? And it wasn't without its moments of radicalism. I mean, emblematic of this in some ways is Olof Palme and his ability to have gotten U.S.-Swedish relations suspended a couple of times. which is a sort of interesting moment that happened in 1968 and then again in 1972. And that in some ways demonstrates sort of the the commitment of social democratic internationalism to still a sort of a level of sort of challenging the structures of the powers that be, so to speak. A little bit different from Willy Brandt, who was very cozy with the Americans. Of course, that in some ways had to do with the German situation specifically. Although he's also a very interesting figure because he was also the head of the Socialist International, the Socialist International from like 1974 to 1992, roughly. But that gives us sort of one category of kind of 20th century kind of nominally red internationalisms, which is this social democratic route, even though it has some different sort of strains within it. But then there is this whole other sort of variety of what I'm calling kind of red internationalism. And this was the communist world. And this is where compromise with liberal capitalism was not okay, and moves in that direction needed to be quashed, because they compromise with sort of the international capitalist system, and liberalism meant reallowing the inequalities that true internationalism should provide, and by true internationalism was meant things like genuine international solidarity, the equality of people in socioeconomic senses, and not just in terms of sort of theoretical political opportunity, so to speak. And I think one of the real interesting sort of artifacts of this, of course, crops up around the invasion of Czechoslovakia during the Prague Spring of '68, and something that actually doesn't get a lot of discussion anymore. It did at the time, and this was an artifact called socialist international law. And this had begun to be developed a little bit before the '68 invasion of Czechoslovakia happened. But it really took off after the '68 invasion of Czechoslovakia as a kind of post factum attempt to sort of justify the invasion. And it was also an attempt to respond to international law as it was emerging out of the UN and out of with the support of Western powers. And this was largely to say that it was sort of the classic Marxist argument in a kind of way, which is that sort of Western supported international law and UN founded international law was largely a variety of liberal law, and liberalism, as Marx tells us in Work After Work After Work, is it's the right to inequality, basically, right? I mean, this is how he phrases it in any number of places, from Critique of the Gotha Program to the Jewish question. Yes, I mean, the communist vision was, of course, very different, that you needed to have de facto equality, which meant societies much more organized around this maxim of from each according to their ability to each according to their need. The way that this got phrased, though, is that this was an alternative international law system and one that was based on human rights, because real human rights, as Marx put it in on the Jewish question, is full human emancipation, and full human emancipation meant sort of not just kind of the sort of illusion of political opportunity, but actually the socioeconomic foundation that really allowed the full realization of the self. And so by way of socialist international law, if you go back and you look at sort of like legal journals and sort of newspapers and Pravda and stuff like that, and even the writings of guys like Brezhnev, you find actually the invasion of Czechoslovakia defined as a human rights action, which is a kind of sort of interesting sort of moment in sort of the use of this term, and that this was because the Soviet system was by nature internationalist, that invasion took place. And this sort of reveals this kind of funny irony somehow that in a certain way, yes, communists like human rights, and they liked human rights in the name of internationalism, at the same time as they're in fact invading a country, and the the after effects of that invasion were that 100,000 people had to flee Czechoslovakia. Yeah. So this gives us, what this does is this is just intended to sort of reanimate in some ways kind of a world that it seems like as we debate sort of nationalism versus internationalism at the beginning of the 21st century, that we're at the risk of totally forgetting that these kinds of ideas existed. And they were ideas that were challenging in some ways, oppressive in other ways, but also provocative in terms of, I mean, what does internationalism really mean? And if you are going to take up the sort of the cause of kind of real sort of cross-border brotherhood, what does it mean to do that, and what are the different ideological sort of concepts that are available to us as we do that? So the conclusion to this was to do something about where are we today, right? And again, this is sort of thinking from sort of the position of kind of the mainstream media and kind of mainstream discourses on this. Well, we have dead communism, right? We have a social democracy that's forgotten sort of its red nature. And then we have a sort of combination of kind of post-Marxist and postmodern movements that are complex and hard to understand, right? And this is a sort of a kind of sort of interesting moment in this regard. And in some ways, I find this sort of, I mean, we again, in the context of mainstream discourse, we're pushed very much down still this kind of Fukuyama mode of thinking, I think. And I think this gets represented in some of the funny debates that are playing out in Germany over the legacy of Willy Brandt, and also a particularly funny debate around some proclamations that Kevin Kühnert, who's the head of the Social Democrats Youth Wing, made at a certain point. So the far left party in Germany, Die Linke, they've been very busy at certain moments saying that Willy Brandt actually belongs to us, right? And this is a kind of sort of interesting moment somehow that sort of the center of politics has shifted to the right far enough that actually Willy Brandt, who was a pretty mainstream figure in many ways, in sort of the mid-late 20th century, he would now register on the far left of the political scale somehow, and actually there's a pretty good argument to be made for that. And then Kühnert, he got himself very excited at a couple of speeches in front of the Youth Wing and said that BMW should be collectivized. And he was quickly slapped down by the party leadership for doing that, because the SPD in Germany is not that kind of socialists anymore. This just leaves us with this question, because there are still a few sort of left social democrats who still relate to kind of the spirit of this sort of international humanity and full human emancipation that is still genealogically comes from the works of Marx. And one of these is Hilda Matthijs, and she has expressed the goal of social democracy, that it should be to fight every inequality. And my question at the end of the paper was where we could find that sentiment, except in international movements that for some people are difficult to understand. So that was that paper. You can also just read it.
Yes, thanks a lot, Ben.